Okay, let's go ahead and word of prayer, and I'm going to give the time to stand. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time you've given us to come together as your people. Abide with us now. Give us faith. Give us strength and courage, Lord. Bless the two ladies that are suffering, that are hurting at this time. From the Sanchez family, we ask that you will lift them up in prayer, Father, that you will be their strength and redeemer, that you will comfort the family that are hurting and that are suffering because of this. Abide with them now, Lord, as you abide with all your people. Keep them in the hollow of your hand. Protect them from the evil that is around us, Father, and keep us safe from harm. Bless everyone from the youngest to the oldest. Keep us protected, Lord, and worries and concerns that we know, we may know about and those that we may not know about. Forgive us for our inadequacies and our weaknesses, Lord, but fill us with your presence as you cover us with grace. So these things we ask in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Okay, brother.
Okay, so the lesson is called The Children Are Free, and that'll make more sense as we go into it. We're going to be focusing on just a few verses of the Bible and really studying them, and I'm going to be expecting you to participate quite a bit. Otherwise, it's going to be a very short lesson. So the idea is that there's a miracle. Jesus did many miracles, but there's one of those miracles that almost no one seems to remember that. And it's the miracle of the fish with the coin in its mouth. Who remembers that? Yeah, almost nobody does. It's only 4 verses, and they don't really connect to anything before it or after it. And it's an odd miracle. It's unusual in that no one is healed or brought back from the dead or nothing like that happens. And it's not intended for the public. This is all the other miracles that Jesus did were intended for the public to see. They're done out in public. This one's not like that. This one instead is intended to teach a lesson. So it's a very different miracle. And some of you are probably still scratching your head saying, I don't actually remember that one. Well, we'll get to the verses in just a moment here. So in this miracle, what happens is a fish becomes the source of a coin that's needed to pay a tax. But it's much more to it. It's much deeper than that. We're not going to be so interested in the miracle itself, but in the curious words that Jesus is teaching. And this is some teaching that Jesus is giving Peter about who Jesus is. And we'll see that as we dig into the depths of these verses. So, and Jesus' teaching comes down to the point of the children are free. And that's the name of this lesson. And we'll see Jesus say that. And as we go along, we'll understand better what he means by that. So here's the 4 verses, and I'll read them. And then I want you to participate and let me know what you see in here, what you can make out of what these verses are saying. And it says, and when they came to Capernaum, those who take the 2 quarter shekels head tax came to Peter and said to him, does not your rabbi pay the 2 quarter shekels? And he said to them, yes. And when Peter entered the house, Yeshua anticipated him and said to him, how does it seem to you, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take taxes and head money? From their children or from strangers? And Simon said to him, from strangers. Then Yeshua said to him, then the children are free. But lest we give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a fish hook, and the first fish that comes up, open its mouth, and you will find a shekel. Take that and give for me and for you. So now you're all saying, boy, I don't remember having read that before. Matthew 17, 24, 27, if you have any doubts. Okay, so tell me, what's going on here? Can somebody give me kind of an overview of what's happening in these verses?
God provides in a miracle way.
Anyone else see anything of interest in here? Or any questions?
Let's see. Yeah, I'm not, other than to show a miracle, I'm not really figuring out what the fish has to do with either strangers or children. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it is confusing. I think that's probably part of the reason why a lot of people read through this and just kind of goes in and goes back out, and no one understands it. So we'll dig into what all of this means. First of all, I'll ask you some questions here. Well, actually, I'll just tell you, first of all, Capernaum is a little fishing village on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. So it's nothing for the people in Capernaum to go out and throw a fish hook into the sea. Galilee, Jesus isn't asking him to do a big thing here to get this fish. It's just kind of outside the doorway and down the hill a little bit. So there's 2/4 shekels head tax. Do we understand how taxing worked back in those days? Can someone describe what you know of that?
Yeah, that's weird. I mean, were they just coincidentally coming into town when the taxes were due, or anybody that came into that town just had to pay a tax? I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, and that's a good one. Taxation worked very differently back then than it does now. And this was one of many taxes throughout the years. And so at a certain period in the year, sometimes there would be like a week-long period when a particular tax was due. And there were tax collectors, and the Bible talks about tax collectors and how they were hated so much. Tax collectors would go out and find people and make sure that everybody paid that head tax. And so they were very motivated to find that because they got paid from that. Some percentage of that head tax, or whatever the tax was at the time that they were paying, came to them. And so they would go out and hunt down people to make sure everybody had paid their tax. So when they're asking here, does not your rabbi pay the 2/4 shekels? They're asking, now shekel is money. It was a silver coin. So they're going to be much more pushy about this than you could probably read into this verse. They're more accusative, as though, hey, did your rabbi pay the tax? And so we need to understand how taxation works, and there's a lot of things to it. One of the things is these shekels, which are the coins of that time. And there's a particular period of time. So Jesus just happens to be coming into Capernaum as this head tax is taxable. And so he's being accosted by these tax collectors who have come to make sure that they can get their share of the tax money that they can collect. And so this is also called a head tax. Now, a head tax is interesting. We don't have an equivalent to that. All we do is income taxes pretty much. A head tax is a per head. So every head pays the same. So this 2/4 shekels would be paid by every person, whether they were dead poor or whether they were filthy rich. They would pay that same 2/4 shekels head tax. And on the next screen, we'll see a little bit more about why exactly this tax was coming at this time. And so that's a different thing for us, is that throughout the year, maybe 6 times a year, there would be different taxes that were collected. And at this particular time, this particular tax is being collected. And as they go into Capernaum, they run into the tax collectors there who are looking for people who haven't paid to make sure they collect that. And so they did have the equivalent of something like income taxes, but these taxes were a little different. These were a head tax, so everybody paid the same amount for this tax. And the Bible actually said that that's how this particular tax should be collected. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along here. Okay, so the tax collectors asked Peter if the rabbi pays this. And he says, yes, which makes sense to him because everybody is supposed to be paying that as far as he knows. And as he goes into the room, he enters the house, and Jesus already knows what Peter has done outside the house and is waiting for him. And he begins asking him these curious questions, and he's making a point. And as you were saying, Chance, it's hard to figure out what the point is here. And he asks him this curious question: from whom do the kings of the earth take taxes and head money? From their children or from strangers? Now, he's asking a question that us in our times of taxation, we wouldn't understand. But back then, the king wouldn't tax his own children, his own people, his own staff. He would see that as making no sense at all because he's taxing them from the money that he's paying them. And so why not just pay them less or pay them more or whatever was necessary? So it would make no sense for a king to tax his own children because they were paid from him. In our society, we don't do it that way. Everybody pays the same tax, and we like to think that that's more fair. But in that time, a king wouldn't tax his own staff and his own children because that just wouldn't make any sense to him. Instead, he taxes everybody else, the people who are strangers to him. And so Simon thinks about it for a second and says, of course, the king taxes from strangers. And so this is when Jesus says those curious words. He says, then the children are free. Free of what? Well, that's what we're going to look into as we go along. And then he also says these words about, but lest we give them offense. And so we'll go into these things bit by bit as we break down each of these verses. Any questions so far on what you've seen in here and I haven't explained? Okay. So the first verse of those sets says, and when they came to Capernaum, those who take the 2 quarter shekels head tax came to Peter and said to him, does not your rabbi pay the 2 quarter shekels? So Peter, these people are speaking to Peter, and they're tax collectors, and they were disliked, as I said before, and they're generally considered sinners because with some of the taxes, they did the evaluation of what the tax should be. With this 2 quarter shekels tax, it was the same for everybody. But with some of the taxes, they would look at your property and make an assessment based on what you owned, and they could rate it high or low and whatever it was. So people often felt that the tax collectors were taking too much and weren't being fair, treating one person different than another. And so they were generally not just disliked, they were generally considered to be sinners because of some of the things that they did. And so there's a verse about this particular, or not a verse, there's a quote that I have here about this particular tax. And this was a temple tax. It was to support the temple. And the quote says, after the return from Babylonian captivity, all males among the Jews of 20 years of age and upwards, on the ground of the command in Exodus 30:13, were required to contribute annually the sum of half a shekel, 2 quarter shekels, by way of defraying the expenses connected with the temple services. After the destruction of the temple, the money went to the capital. It was still collected, although it didn't go to the temple anymore. The time for collecting this tax was the 15th of the month of Adar. So on this particular day is when they would collect this tax from everybody. So all the tax collectors would go out and grab everybody and make sure that everybody paid the tax, and they would get their commission from that tax. So this is one of those many taxes throughout a year that would be collected on a particular date. And so, as I said before, their tone in this would be pushy, demanding, and sometimes accusative. And so there would be people who would lie to them and say, I already paid Joe down the street here, he got me, and things like that. And people would probably also try to be in between towns so they weren't collected from, but that's not a winning game. The tax wasn't that much money that it made it worthwhile to go out and live outside the city for a day or even a couple of days sometimes to avoid this tax. And so when they ask this question about whether the rabbi pays the tax, they're really saying, who does your master think he is that he hasn't paid? So they're much more accusative than you might see in that. And their master was a teacher of God, is what they're saying, and therefore the tax is for the temple of God, so surely he must be paying the temple tax. And so they're very motivated, as I said, to make sure everyone pays the tax because they get a commission. They get part of what they collect. So taxation was very different back then, and we need to understand that because that's a factor in understanding what's going on here. So this temple tax is being collected in the same way that other taxes were collected done by tax collectors who would go out and confront the people and demand that they paid the tax. And I imagine sometimes people even got double taxed if they couldn't prove that they had paid somebody else. So they had a motivation there to make sure that everybody collected the tax. Okay, the next verse. So this is Peter answering back to the tax collectors. And he said to them, yes. And when Peter entered the house, Yeshua anticipated him, and he said to him, how does it seem to you, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take taxes and head money? From their children or from strangers? And I mentioned a little bit about how taxes were taken and that kings didn't tax their own children. So this verse marks a really interesting change in the text. Until this verse, the text has been calling Peter, Peter, but now it starts calling him Simon. And for the rest of these verses, he's going to be referred to as Simon. And transitions like that often have a meaning to them. Subtle things like that sometimes go past us. But Jesus has been calling him Peter, which is the name that Jesus gave him. And now Jesus is going to start calling him Simon. And the text also does the same thing when it isn't Jesus speaking. And they're going to start calling him Simon, which was his given name from birth. And so if we see Simon as being a secular name and Peter is a spiritual name, then Jesus appears to be saying, from a man's perspective, what do you think? And whether Simon Peter understands that can't be clear in this. But there are many other cases like that where names are used that way, names having meaning of spiritual nature and human nature. So in this case, he's also hinting at something that Peter has been thinking like a man. And he says, you've been thinking like a man here. So what do you think of these kings and how they tax people? And the reason he's doing this is that Peter has committed Jesus to do something. And remember how the tax collectors asked Peter if his rabbi paid the tax. That wasn't really a disciple's role to do, is to represent his rabbi like that. And he did, and he committed Jesus to paying this tax. And that's the problem that Jesus is having here. And he's going to be explaining to Peter about what's wrong about this. And this is going to be kind of new to us who haven't thought about these things before. So it's wrong for Peter to speak on behalf of his rabbi and commit him to doing things like that. But there's also more to it. And that's what Jesus is going to be getting into as we go through the rest of these verses. Any questions on anything there?
Well, but my guess is Peter was, number one, a little bit scared of being accosted. Number two, he's probably trying to protect. In his mind, he's probably trying to protect his master, because he's probably thinking, if they ask him that and he goes, I don't know, why don't you ask him? Jesus might have he was probably thinking, I'm protecting both myself and Jesus, because I'm not going to say, I don't know if he pays the tax.
Yes, I think you're probably right there. And that way of thinking falls on us sometimes too. We often think that we're doing something good when in fact we don't really understand the situation and we're not doing something good. And that's going to be the case here, is that, yeah, more than likely Peter felt that he was doing the right thing by answering yes and saving the trouble of Jesus being bothered. But unfortunately, he isn't really supposed to speak for his teacher, his rabbi, like that. And so the message that Jesus is giving him is a spiritual message. It's quite a deep message. And I'm sure that Peter wouldn't have understood it immediately himself. He probably doesn't even understand it until he goes down and goes fishing for that coin and has some time to think about exactly what was said and why and what the meanings were of that. But Jesus' question actually has three levels to it. He's talking on the surface level of the text about earthly kings and their earthly children and others who are not their children, which the verse refers to as strangers, whether the kings tax their own children or whether they tax strangers. And so that's the bottom level of it. But Jesus' level is more about, think about earthly kings and God's children and others who are not God's children. What's the situation there? Does the king tax God's children? Do others than not God's children pay the tax? And then the third level to that is, if God is the king, does God tax his children? Do others other than God's children pay that tax? So there's these different levels to it that are deeper in what Jesus is saying. And he even expands the context here by talking not just about this particular head tax. He refers to kings and all of their taxes and all of their head monies that they would collect throughout the year. So this is kind of the point that he's making, is there's more going on here. He's going to be going into this idea that there's more to this than just paying taxes. It's about who Jesus is going to be a part of it that we're going to see here. And whether Jesus, these taxes would apply to Jesus. And that kind of goes back to, is Jesus just a man or is he somebody special? So all of these things are going to come into this question that we're seeing here. So going on with verse 26, and Simon said to him, from strangers. Then Yeshua said to him, then the children are free. And this is this odd statement here. So Peter is answering from a man's perspective. He thinks of earthly kings and earthly children. And yes, so the earthly kings don't charge their children with taxes. They charge people who are not in their family, who are outside that, who are strangers to them. And so the children of the king were exempt from the taxes of the king at that time. And so Simon Peter knows that. That's the way things work. And so that's how he answers from a man's perspective, because that's how it works. And so, as we said before, what sense would it make for the king's money to go to his children and then be taxed, and for the taxes to go back to the king? You can see how that would make no sense to a king at that time. And so, if paying the taxes, if his children paid the taxes and that left them short, the king would just give them more money. You can see how it doesn't really make a lot of sense that way. And as I said before, in our society, everybody pays. But Jesus' answer here is about the children are free, means that the tax, there is no tax obligation on the children that is imposed by the king. So they're free of that tax obligation, is what he's talking about. And I hope that that's clear about this, is when he says the children are free, he means free of the king's taxes. So he's saying the children of the king are free of the king's taxes. And in the earthly sense, yes, that's what that means. Any questions on that?
I just hope that doesn't encourage people not to pay their taxes. That would get in a lot of trouble there.
Yes, yeah, don't be assuming that. The next verse is going to clear up that. And then we're going to actually take this study in next week and go in some different directions that are related to all of this. But yeah, pay your taxes. And in fact, the next verse is going to talk about that. So any questions, comments on this so far? Okay. So the last verse, and this one is curious as well. He says, "But lest we give offense to them, to the tax collectors, go to the sea and cast a fish hook, and the first fish that comes up, open its mouth, and you will find a shekel. Take that and give for me and for you." So, and take that shekel and give as tax for me and for you. So it's going to be a 1 shekel that you're going to find, a 1 shekel coin you'll find in the fish's mouth, which is 2 sets of quarter shekels or 2 half shekels, which is the tax. So there's enough tax in the fish's mouth to pay for 2 people. And Jesus tells him, pay for yourself, pay for me. Okay, so
that's how Esther got on.
When Jesus says, lest we give offense to them, he's showing those other levels that I talked about before. He says, for earthly kings, their children are free of the tax, and others who are strangers pay the tax. When God is the king, the spiritual children are free of the tax, and others pay. And so what he's really getting to, the idea is that he is the child of God, and therefore these taxes don't apply to him. But he's saying also here, about the giving offense, we'll dig into that too. So he says, for earthly kings who are lesser kings in God's kingdom, God's spiritual children are free, and the king's children are free, and others pay. And that's similar to our own taxes. Our different levels of government don't tax each other. They only tax the people below them. So it's not that strange a concept that some people don't get charged these taxes. And Jesus is really talking about this idea that God's kingdom is above the world's kingdoms and is different. And this might be a novel concept for you, but we'll see it as we dig into this some more. So his point is that he, Jesus, is a child of God the King. And Peter has failed to recognize all of that means. Now, we know that at that time they were coming to understand that Jesus was the Messiah, and they were starting to come to grips with that, but not all the depths of what that really meant. And this is another case of that, where he has spoken for Jesus and committed Jesus to do something. And Jesus says, there is no obligation for me to pay that tax. I am a child of God. The tax doesn't apply to me, is what he's saying. And but then he goes on and says, but failure to pay that tax would offend the tax collectors. And offending the tax collectors would mean that then there would be soldiers and swords and clubs and jail, because that's what happened if you didn't pay your taxes. And so he's saying it isn't an obligation for me to pay the tax, but we're going to pay the tax so that we don't cause trouble and don't, in fact, destroy our message. The message we're trying to bring to people would be damaged if we were to be thrown in jail for not paying a tax. And you may remember sometimes the Pharisees would go to Jesus with questions about paying tax, because that was a hot button issue in that time. And so because of these things, the tax is going to be paid, and the payment is going to come from the fish. Any questions there? Okay.
So now we understand, at least me, how when Jesus came down and became a man, took a mortal form, how really, I mean, he is the child of God. He's the begotten son. He came to earth, and, you know, he didn't have to do this. He didn't have to pay that tax. He didn't, you know, but, you know, this example just brings to light and to mind and to recognition how really he had to, you know, just bow, you know, not bow, but just accept, you know, all these, you know, having to pay taxes, having to just be like us, and just having to just
Submit himself.
Right. For
Yep.
us. He would die for us so that he could die for us, and he would be able to redeem us.
Yeah. And the same thing is an example for us. We have to submit ourselves many times. And in the same way that he is going to pay this tax, we pay our taxes. And we'll dig into the depths of all of that too. So yes, there are many things that we do necessarily in this society to get along, and we submit to society. Of course, there's limits to how far we'll go in that. But yeah, the same idea applies to us. Okay, moving on. So I have some questions now for you. We know that Jesus had a money box. Remember that Judas was in charge of that money box, and Judas was pilfering that money box, taking money out of it for himself. So why didn't Jesus just give Peter some of the money from that money box and have him go and pay the tax collectors that way? What do you think?
It seems to me that would be the easy way out, but he seemed like he uses every opportunity for a teaching lesson. You know, it's like as if, yeah, let's just give the money, whatever. But he didn't want to go that. He didn't want to make it that easy. He wanted to use a teaching lesson out of that, because after all, that's what he is. He's a teacher. You know, he's a master.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is the case here. This is a lesson that not just he is doing, but God has set this whole thing up because Peter needed this lesson. He needed to understand that Jesus isn't just some other man. He's different, and his status is different, and some things don't apply to him because of that. And so yes, this is a teachable moment that's been set up for him to teach. And that's exactly what I said here. So Peter thinks that he can speak for his rabbi, for his teacher, and he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand fully who Jesus is, doesn't understand Jesus' authority, child of God. All of those things are things that he's still a little bit shaky on. He has some idea that he's the Messiah by this time, but it's still not clear what that means to him. And so he tends to think that Jesus is like any other man. And we would do the same thing, I think. You walk around preaching and teaching to people all the time, and Jesus looks just like other people. And so it's easy to think of him as just being like other people, and to forget that inside he's much more than that. He's much different than people, and to understand all of the depths of what that difference means to him. So that's part of this lesson that is being taught here. And so it's also possible, I think, that Jesus feels the money in the money box is reserved for the ministry. That was gifts that were given to him to serve in his ministry, and he doesn't want to take from that ministry box and give that to pay taxes. So that might be part of it as well.
And the other interesting thing is, you mentioned a little bit ago, was that he knows that Judas is actually pilfering that money. And he could stop him if he wants to. He could call his attention to it, but he's letting him do his thing until the time is right, you know, that he gets exposed.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And even in our lives, Jesus is very tolerant of the things that we do, because he tries to bring us back, tries to give us that opportunity to see that we've done wrong and to come back to him. And so, yes, the same thing was being done with Judas, giving him that opportunity.
Yeah, but Judas never got punished for stealing the money. I mean, we know what happened. He ratted Jesus out, and then he felt guilt and hanged himself. But Judas never got punished for stealing all that money. That didn't seem right.
But that's because you're only thinking in the temporal sense. There's a spiritual sense, and everything gets equalized there after life. So yeah, don't worry about that. Some people, rich, wealthy people, sometimes do great evils and live fine and even live to old ages and then die. Don't worry. God says all these things will be taken care of. Don't worry about things being equalized in this life.
Very, very true.
Okay, so next question. Does Jesus pay the tax? And we've kind of touched on this a little bit. What do you think?
Nah, I don't think he didn't take anything of himself. I mean, everything in the world was Jesus, but I would say no, he himself didn't pay the tax.
Right. So how was the tax paid? Where did that fish come from?
Yeah, I mean, maybe he created the fish. I don't know.
Well, God obviously set up this fish. Somewhere along the way, a fish had found a coin and was eating something or licking the coin, and it got into the fish's mouth, and the fish couldn't get rid of it. And now Peter's going to go out and throw a hook in the water, and there it is, going to bite on his hook. And so God has set this up so that this tax is not going to be paid by Jesus. It's going to be paid by God. He's going to be taking care of this.
I was going to mention that I like to watch a lot of the nature shows on TV, and fish are attracted to shiny things. Like I noticed that people were showing you how you can actually fish with such very basic things that you have on hand. And this guy got a piece of tin foil, and he put it on next to the hook, and there was no worm or nothing, and he throws it in there, and the fish grabbed it because they're attracted to shiny things. And one of the things I remember he mentioned, he says, in fact, I have found coins inside a fish's stomach, when I prepare them. So this is not really that implausible if we may suppose.
No, it's not impossible at all. And if you've ever done any fishing, all of the lures that you use for fishing are highly reflective, shiny, silvery objects that are meant to attract the fish, just like you're saying. So yeah, it's not that odd that a coin would be there. It's a little odd that Jesus would throw in a hook and catch a fish, and the first fish that he catches would have a coin in its mouth. So that's the miracle there. But it's not so odd that a fish would have a coin in its mouth. Okay, so Jesus has committed, or Peter has committed Jesus to paying this tax by saying, yes, he pays the tax. So instead, because Peter committed him, Peter is the one who goes out and collects it from the fish and gives it to the tax collectors, and Jesus never touches it. I think it's fair to say that Jesus doesn't pay the tax himself. The tax gets paid for him by God, as I was saying earlier. Okay, next question. Various taxes were collected throughout the year. Why is this tax just coming up now? No place else in the Bible do we hear about tax collectors trying to collect taxes from Jesus or his disciples or anything like that. This is the only incident where you hear that. But tax collection was done many times a year, and so there must have been other times when the tax collectors were out there. Why do you think we're only hearing about it here? Why is this the only place?
Well, what was the story about who does this coin belong to? And Jesus says, whose picture is on it? That wasn't about taxes. What was that story about?
Yeah, that was sort of about taxes. The question there was, should we pay taxes? And this is the Pharisees asking Jesus about that. And he says, he asks for a coin, and he says, whose face is on the coin? And he says, they say Caesar, and he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. So his point there is a little different. He's saying God isn't interested in the money. God is interested in the spiritual things. And so the physical things are not of interest, but spiritual is everything to God. And so that's kind of a message about our whole lives, really, is these physical things that we live in, the society that we live in, these are not the important things. The important things are the spiritual things. So it's a little different here. In this case, the tax collectors have come to collect. But why is this the only time that we've ever heard of them collecting before? Why is this the only place it's mentioned? And here it's only mentioned because it's a teaching for Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's to show that the most routine, mundane things that happen all the time, every year, Jesus even uses those things to teach a lesson, maybe. Because I mean, think about it. I mean, Jesus could have just made the tax collector go away. He could have just made the tax collector say, "Oh, you've already paid your tax," and then just walked away. It would have been that easy. But he still went through all the trouble of paying a tax that they really couldn't have made him pay. So that's what I was thinking, to show that he uses even the most mundane things to teach lessons.
Yeah. That's really close to what I was thinking. I'm just a shade different on that. I think that that God set this up for the sake of Peter, to teach Peter something. And I suspect that for that same reason, they never ran into tax collectors any other times when tax collectors were out. Remember, they traveled quite a bit, and I imagine that God always arranged things so that the tax collectors always missed them, never found them. And that wouldn't have been a big surprise really to tax collectors, because they tried to find everyone, but some people were hiding, and so they couldn't pay the taxes or wouldn't pay the taxes. And so that's part of what motivated tax collectors to work so hard to get their money. And I expect that in normal cases, the tax collectors never found Jesus and his disciples and never collected anything. I'm going a little bit far there, maybe you might think, but I think that this particular instance was set up as a teaching for Peter. And because of that, I kind of suspect that they never ran into tax collectors other times when the tax collectors were out.
Well, with that said, churches are not supposed to be paying tax anyway,
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a personal thing. This is not like like your own personal taxes that this isn't referring to in this case, but because of them together, they were a religious group, they were a church. So that kind of laid the groundwork for the way that taxes should be paid by a church, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I think that the Bible was the basis for that idea of a 401c organization that doesn't pay taxes because they're a church. Or no, 501c. I think I got that wrong. Okay, so as I was saying, God may have been arranging events in his life so that the tax collectors never found Jesus and his disciples. And this would be the first and only time that this happens. And it happens for that purpose of teaching a lesson. And so this is an opportunity, not just an opportunity, but it's an intentional plan, because Peter needs to learn something here about who Jesus is and that he's not just a man. Things are different for Jesus. So if you think I've stretched that too far, that's fine. But it seems to me that makes sense that way. Fourth question.
I'm sorry, I had a question. I just wanted to comment this. At the same time with this lesson, I'm taking the Jesus one is because and his word says that we need to submit to authorities and the governments are established for him. Yeah. So I'm thinking that if we from him came the idea to set up kings and governments. So it's a way for us to say, hey, you need to support, like, follow the rules, so to say.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah. And I guess that's part of the reason also why I think that we never hear of tax collectors before, is that this would have kept coming up if they had been trying to tax Jesus before. So this seems to be the one and only case of that happening. So if Jesus doesn't have to pay this tax, but he does anyway, is this freedom of the children that he's talking about, is it real, or is it really just an illusion? It's easy to say, well, I don't have to pay this tax, but I'm going to anyway, just so it doesn't cause trouble. is there a real freedom there? But in the end result, if you always pay the taxes according to the taxation rules like any man, aren't you just like any other man? What do you think of that?
I think he was always respectful of authority, and I think he was a good example for us in that sense. There's still too many Christians that will say, I don't like the president, and therefore I don't have to listen to that guy because, whatever. But the Bible is replete with a whole bunch of cases where respect for authority is very essential. I think that's what Sister Esther was talking about as well. So yeah, in reality, he's not a regular man, and he didn't really have to do what he did, but he did it to be an example for them, I think more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go into this more in the next lesson, and dig into a lot of other things as well. But even if you think that this freedom might not be real, there's still a difference in perspective that's important here, and that's really part of the lesson that Peter needed to learn here. And Peter had been thinking of Jesus as just a man, and Jesus is making it clear that I'm not just a man. The rules are different by me. I'm not bound by the rules of men. They don't make any rules that stick to me. I am free of their rules. And so don't think of me as just a man like other men. And that was really that change in perspective that he wanted Peter to come to. He wanted Peter to stop thinking of Jesus as a man like other men, but to realize that he's something much more than that. And so there was a whole point behind this change of perspective that he wanted to see in Peter. And perhaps other disciples were picking this up as well. Doesn't say. Okay, fifth question. Are we the children of God in this sense? And that's what we'll really go into next week, is what does it mean to be a child of God? What things apply to us? What doesn't apply to us? How do we behave in this society? And we'll look at all of those important questions here that have to be coming up. And so next week, we'll be talking about, can I stop paying my taxes now? And what other authorities do I have that I don't know about? And so that will be next week, and continue paying your taxes. You already know the answer to that one, but we'll explain why you pay your taxes next week. And so that's where we will go next week on this study.
I know.
Brother, go
Sorry?
ahead.
No, go ahead.
Somebody needs to go ahead.
Yeah.
Mine was just going to be a joke, so mine wasn't important. So, sister.
All right, I think we're done then.
Brother, I just wanted the Bible reference so I can kind of review it for next time.
Yeah. Okay, Matthew 17:24 through 27 are the verses that we studied today.
Brother.
Next week, we're going to jump into a whole bunch of different places in the Bible and look at other things where we are different from the just ordinary people. We are children of God in some sense, and we'll dig into those kind of things. So I think you'll find that interesting. And it's important for us to understand that too. We shouldn't ever just think of ourselves as good people in a society. We are much more than that. God has made us much more than that, declared us to be much more than that. And so that's part of what I want you to pick up from this whole series, is that we're not like other men in the same sense that Jesus is not like men either.